All right, so I think we're going to begin today's webinar as folks are starting to file into the room. So I want to welcome everyone and thank you for attending our third CASPR webinar session, focusing on arts-based and newly emerging methodologies. My name is Laura Canoy, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Briefly, I'm a postdoctoral associate for the Pepper Partnership and COPE2 studies, both of which are being led by Dr. Fiona Webster at Western University in Canada. I also play a key role with CASPR. We have an excellent panel of speakers today who will be speaking about the exciting ways that arts-based and other methodologies can play in critical pain scholarship. We're going to try to set aside some time at the end of the session today for Q&A, and we are actually setting aside an extra 10 minutes to allow for this. So please submit questions via the Q&A function or the chat box. To save time, please feel free to pose these questions anytime during the session. And if we run out of time, and if you're a CASPR member, you can continue the conversation with our presenters in our discussion board on the website. And for those of you who are just learning about CASPR, please be sure to visit our website at criticalpainscholarship.ca. Also, please be sure to follow the COPE study on Twitter to stay up to date on CASPR webinars, and that Twitter handle is @COPE_study. So our first speaker for today's session is Dr. Jen Tarr, a senior lecturer in the social science research methods and director of researcher education and development in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Newcastle University in the UK. A health sociologist by background, she has led research on arts-based and social media methods for studying chronic pain and is currently writing a book on pain and visual images. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Laura. So the paper that I'm going to briefly talk through today is actually a paper on the sociality of pain, and I'm drawing out the kind of the methodological aspects of that work. So I'm very interested in your feedback and comments. The images that are here and throughout the presentation today are drawn from some work I did on a project with colleagues at the London School of Economics on communicating chronic pain and interdisciplinary strategies for non-textual kinds of chronic pain communication. So I've been interested in the debates going on in pain science in particular around what the social actually is. And this is something that came up as we were preparing for today's webinar, actually, and we were talking about some of the main pain organizations and their sections on the social aspects of pain and how that doesn't quite fit with a lot of critical pain scholarship and the kind of work that many of us are doing. And I trace this particularly, I think a good example is Williams and Craig's paper on a new definition of pain, where they highlight the social aspects, and they say that social environments determine exposure to pain, thoughts and feelings when in pain, communication of distress to others and others' experiences and responses. Healthcare delivery systems, all human and some animal pain studies are inherently social. So we need to, with a biopsychosocial model, we need to explicitly acknowledge the sociality of pain. And this received this was published in the journal Pain, and it received quite a lot of correspondence and critics who commented that the social components are consequences rather than central to pain, and wondered, what about hermits in pain? There was another paper where people brought up the desert island. Well, can a person on a desert island not experience pain? And the sort of idea that pain is something that goes on in big social events like social experiences go on in big events like concerts and political rallies. So it's challenging to understand how the qualities of those are useful in characterizing pain, particularly when pain is the thing that makes people often feel very alone. At the same time, in pain science scholarship, there's a body of work that is going on around the social stratification of pain and a greater awareness of how pain is shaped socially. So acknowledgement that socioeconomic disadvantage maps onto experiences of pain and levels of pain disability, that things like lack of work autonomy, unemployment, the people who are Indigenous, recent immigrants and refugees, people of color, LGBTQ+ people, those with lower levels of education, people with mental health and substance abuse challenges, are vulnerable to a higher prevalence of painful medical conditions, as well as having more barriers to receiving care. There's also a recent study that suggests that as levels of unemployment rise, so do levels of persistent pain in the general population. So there's been a general argument that this is not only a kind of a social level experience, it also works on a physiological level. It's not just something that's out there, but also works on people's bodies. The discrimination inflicts continued trauma, which increases hypervigilance and stress. And this is a study on racism, particularly in Black, Latinx, and Indigenous patients. And collectively, then these factors lead to greater negative cumulative impact on both physical and mental health, and are manifest in various changes in the body, in cardiovascular and metabolic and inflammatory responses, as well as psychological ones. In 2014, there was an article in Anesthesiology where two writers suggested that we needed a socio-psychobiological model of pain rather than a biopsychosocial one. And they said the way that pain is taught in the medical curriculum resembles an approach to driver education in which classes in combustion chemistry and auto mechanics are mandatory, while on-road training in courtesy and defensive driving amidst traffic is optional. So they say the priority is the wrong way around. Actually, we need to be teaching about the social first. I think what we can take from some of this work is that there's several models of the social in pain science. So the first is the one that we see in the debates around that Williams and Craig's new definition of pain, and that's that the social only exists in direct contact and interaction with others. So it's only at the level of expression or communication, or when we are in groups with other people, that pain exists and that it's manifested. So it's essentially an individual and private experience. And I think there is a thread of social science work that also kind of emphasizes this individuality and the privateness of pain, the unshareability of pain that Elaine Scarry talks about, for instance. There's another body of work that talks about pain, that talks about the social as a structuring device in relation to pain. So it's the social is something that sorts people according to categories. Some people within the system are more advantaged than others, but it's unclear how those impacts kind of filter down at an individual level. And in sociological work, we see this as sort of the debate between structure and agency, between the individual and the social, and how those move together. We can also see a group of work starting to cohere around the idea that pain is this kind of force that writes bodies and leaves neurobiological signatures, but whose mechanisms are unknown and not really understood. And I think one of the reasons for this, my argument, one of the reasons for this, that we don't have that connection very well formulated in pain science in particular, is a methodological problem. And that is that the tools that are used in pain research tend to be things that don't really have a lot of space for the social. They're things like experiments, imaging scans, particularly neuroimaging that look at people's brains, and there has been a predominance in recent pain science of the kind of neurobiological methods and neurology as a way of working. So neuroimaging has had a huge influence on the field. Analyses of survey data, on the other hand, and then sometimes on the more individual level, the case study, the study sample of one. And it's very difficult to find the social within those methods. It's also the case that when we're looking at broader survey types of samples, when we're controlling for variables in something like a regression analysis, there's an implied linear mode of causality, that this thing affects this thing. One of the papers in pain science around this area suggests that racism works in a dose-response fashion. Well, I think most social sciences would say it's not. It isn't really working in that kind of simple way, straightforward way. It also implies that variables are easily identified and that they're separable, that we know in advance what our variables might be, and we can just control for them and see how this works out. And Nicholas Rose and Joel Abi-Rashed have suggested in their work on neuroscience that it's been limited largely to a theory of sociality that renders it in terms of the capacities required to maintain interactions between individuals and small groups, because that's the only kind of sociality that can enter the experimenter's purview. And I think we see this problem throughout pain science, particularly as it relies on neuroscience, is this very small, very, very narrow kind of model of the social. So I want to really encourage and highlight what we as critical pain scientists and pain researchers can do differently. And this is really to kind of think about the role of our methods in producing the thing that we're studying. So this is an awareness that comes out of recent work in the social life of methods, for instance, and in Karen Barad's work, for instance, on the agency of methods and the role of methods as part of the apparatus of the thing that we study, that our methods are not just documenting or representing a particular reality, they're also constituting that. They're involved in producing the phenomena under study. Now, that doesn't mean that we can choose just any method and produce any reality we want, but it means that we need to make active and ethical kinds of choices about how we're conducting our research that focus on what kinds of versions of pain and pain research do we want to be putting forward. How do we bring the social back in? Are there ways that we can make more nested or more communal kinds of versions of pain in our work? This is the quote here from Nathan Mitchell is from his work in conversation analysis, but I think it applies very well to a lot of kind of critical work and less critical work in the sociology of pain, where he says, if we ask patients about illness, then we'll get narratives about illness. However, given the opportunity, would patients prefer to downplay or even ignore the role of illness as a stigmatized condition in their lives? So I think we need to ask ourselves those questions about what is it that people with pain want to talk about, want to put across, and what might that look like? Now, in my own work on communicating chronic pain, that has focused a lot on arts-based methods and digital methods, evaluating, kind of looking at what's on social media in relation to pain and pain communication. So in adapting these methods to social research, our priority is usually on process over product. It's not about making great art out of it. It's about the creative process and what we get out of that and how that allows us to produce particular versions of pain. And so in our work, for instance, rather than trying to focus on empathy, what we found our participants in arts workshops wanted to do was think about creation and transformation and disruption of some of their experiences of pain. And as we worked more socially in groups with other people with pain, this became clearer and clearer in terms of the highlight on listening, not just on having other people empathize, because in many cases people didn't want another person to be able to feel their pain. That wasn't part of the goal. And the images that come here are from a discussion that people had about sharing a pain object or not. And the person, a carer, wanted to take the pain away. And the person with pain said, but I don't want to give it to you. And so they came to this kind of discussion about that. So really thinking about what new versions of pain we can produce through our methods is kind of what I want to leave you with, and thinking about sharing in that creation and that ownership.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jen. What a great introduction to today's session. So our next speaker is Dr. Karime Mescouto, who is a physiotherapist and a postdoctoral researcher at Recover at the University of Queensland, Australia. Before pursuing her PhD, Dr. Mescouto worked as a clinician and as a physiotherapy lecturer. In her doctoral research, she was interested in enhancing low back pain healthcare delivery by critically looking at the biopsychosocial model of health. She used a variety of critical qualitative methodologies and collaborated with clinicians and people with the experience of back pain to explore the social, cultural, and interpersonal aspects of clinical and research practices. She holds a master's degree in rehabilitation science and a graduate certificate in clinical physiotherapy. Dr. Mescouto is interested in critical participatory qualitative methodologies and incorporating sociological thinking into physiotherapy research and practice to foster more equitable healthcare practices. Thank you, Karime.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So thanks everyone for being here. Before I start my presentation, I just would like to make an acknowledgement of country. I'm based in Brisbane, Miagen, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which I meet, the Turrbal and Yagur people, and pay my respect to their ancestors and their descendants, and also kind of extend my respect to any Indigenous peoples here today. So as Laura mentioned, I'm a physio by background, but my thesis, some of the work that I'll be presenting here today, can be considered between two worlds: physiotherapy, health sciences, and sociology. So the title of this presentation is connected to the final paper of my PhD and the whole idea of going beyond the biopsychosocial model. So that links really well with what Jen mentioned in her presentation. So I'll be presenting a little bit towards an ethical multiplicity in pain care, practicing beyond the biopsychosocial model. So to align with today's amazing discussions on arts-based or newly emerging methodologies, I'll focus on the methodology and the methods I engaged during my PhD, but not the findings. But if anyone is interested, this is the paper that I actually will be talking about today. So I'm going to start with the end in mind. So in my thesis, I actually argued that the biopsychosocial model is not working as it is. So this model was proposed as an attempt to incorporate complexity into healthcare and shift from a biomedical model or treating the body as a machine to a more comprehensive or complex perspective that acknowledges physical, psychological, and social dimensions as important. But actually, I argue that low back pain care or pain care should go beyond this traditional fragmented and limited trifecta of biopsycho and social. Because in the past 3 decades, this model, right, has faced important criticisms. It has been kind of quite difficult to apply it in practice, and focusing on today's presentations, it has a lack of a clear theoretical foundation. And aligned with the previous speaker, there is an underappreciation of its social aspects and other elements as well beyond the model, such as culture, institutional and interpersonal power dynamics, ethics, spirituality, stigma, and so forth. So to address or try to address these critiques, instead of using grand theories or a specific methodology in my PhD and in my work, I engaged with the post-qualitative process of thinking with concepts, specific concepts, to unfold an understanding of the biopsychosocial model in low back pain care. So thinking with concepts or following concepts can be considered as the methodology itself, because concepts are not mere words, they are filled with meaning and history and affect and impact. So one of the concepts that I used or engaged with in the article that I mentioned was the concept of multiplicity, and in my PhD as well, from ethnographer and philosopher Anne-Marie Moll. And multiplicity actually turns our attention to the fact that practices not only produce different perspectives, but also produce or enact different realities. And I really like one of Moll's quote when she mentions that the humane does not reside exclusively in psychosocial matters. However important feelings and interpretations may be, they are not alone in making up what life is all about. Day-to-day reality, the life we live, is also a fleshy affair, a matter of chairs and tables, food and air, machines and blood, of bodies. So multiplicity really brings our attention to how human and non-humans, right, objects, things, chairs, tables, they're all part of enacting reality. But then if reality is multiple, right, what should we focus on in this reality? So here's where the second concept that I engage with is imperative. So nomadic ethics is a concept from philosopher Rosi Braidotti that goes beyond bioethics and recognize, rests on a multi-layered form of relationality, which prioritize a more contextual and dynamic approach to ethics that recognize social, political, historical, environmental, power relational forces responsible to interact and shape our relations in the world. So these concepts were kind of my, my theoretical underpinnings. And also I engage with collaborative and relational methods to kind of explore this going beyond the biopsychosocial model. And just as a disclosure, these methods that I'll be presenting were developed by my primary supervisor, Dr. Jenny Setchell, and a team of researchers from Toronto. So in this work that I did in the paper and in my thesis, I engaged with two settings located here in Brisbane, Australia, a private physiotherapy clinic and a public multidisciplinary pain service. So they had, clinicians from different specialities, physios, psychologists, psychiatrists, pain specialists, and so forth, and individuals with low back pain. So why am I saying that these are, relational methods? So the two main data collection methods I used were ethnographic observations of clinical practices, researchers going to these clinics and then taking notes of what was going on in the room, what was going on in the consultation. And also I did participatory dialogues with clinicians where we kind of discussed relevant information from these observations with clinicians from each site, just to challenge their usual ways of working, inviting them to critically reflect on healthcare norms, the practices, and how things could be done differently, and going, understanding more the social, cultural, and political aspects of health. And, to bring more this relationality, we actually, the observations and the dialogues were analyzed by, not only the clinicians analyzed the observations, but we had a team of researchers, from different disciplinary backgrounds, including clinicians from the study sites, including, and by people with lived experience of low back pain, or what we call as advisors, who provided the input into the study design, the analysis, and recommendations. So, these methods and this analysis, they were all, iterative. So thinking about the concepts that I presented, previously of multiplicity, of nomadic ethics, here our research practices included these relations between bodies, between places, between, research tools, contextual elements of research, that shaped what we kind of discussed and attended to. And, this kind of bringing clinicians, researchers, people with lived experience together was kind of our aim to also address power dynamics in research. To kind of gather different experiences, perspectives, add different discourses from various groups on low back pain care, on pain care. And then that's why there is this relational and ethical way of kind of conducting research as well, to kind of explore these different dimensions of pain. So, through this concepts, through this methods and methodology that I use, we realized that low back pain care, that pain is actually multiple. It goes beyond the biopsychosocial model. incorporates theoretical assumptions, interpersonal power dynamics, knowledge systems, you know, and these are just a few of the multiple aspects that play a role in low back pain care. You know, they are not fixed, they are not rigid, they're permeable, right? They're always changing, always shifting towards this flexibility of incorporating these multiple aspects into pain care. And seeing this multiplicity or these multiple aspects of low back pain care was only possible with the concepts and methods that I engaged with. So what I called this ethical multiplicity, you know, of research of pain care or low back pain care, you know, allowed practices to be attentive to power dynamics and their relation to knowledge systems. They were deeply relational, you know, care is deeply relational as it recognized reality as being shaped by human and non-human actors, by things, by chairs, by tables, and is committed to a context-dependent, dynamic approach to ethics as well. So these are just a few of the articles that I published during my PhD, if you are interested. So that was a little bit of, you know, exploring concepts as methodology and the methods to kind of bring this multiplicity of care to the table. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Karime, for that excellent presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Gabi Schaffzin, who is an artist, educator, and researcher based in Toronto. He's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Design at York University's School of Arts, Media, Performance, and Design. He holds a PhD in art history, theory, and criticism from the University of California, San Diego, and an MFA from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. His dissertation project combined design theory, disability studies, and a history of computing to trace the history of designed pain scales in the United States throughout the 20th century. Thank you, Gabi.
Thanks, Laura. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are, I suppose. I'm Gabi. Thanks to Fiona and Laura for having me here this morning to talk about a project which I started for my dissertation and continue to work on today. I take as my objects of inquiry the graphic pain scale, a critical category of technique and a core component of pain medicine, and thus a core component of the ways that pain came to be understood and communicated by medical professionals and by people in pain since the late 20th century. How and in what sorts of practices and forms did this graphic design entity, the pain scale, emerge, and how has it informed and delimited pain communication, pain knowledge, and pain experience? To address these questions, we must also consider how graphic design has intersected not only with medicine, but also with the experiences of people in pain, informing our expression and communication of our pain. My focus is on the graphical and its complex and enmeshed relationship of difference from and continuity with the pictorial. I look at the informational's similarly complex relationship to the representational. Building on research on graphic medicine, including relatively recent movements to understand medicine through graphic novels and comics, I suggest that my research falls under the rubric of graphic pain. How does a designed graphical interface collect quantitative information, shape the subjectivity of the patient, and transform conceptualizations of what pain looks like? Tobin Siebers wrote in 2006 that, quote, "The greatest stake in disability studies at the present moment is to find ways to represent pain and to resist current models that blunt the political effectiveness of these representations." I use disability studies throughout this project to think about the ways that the normative jettisons in the name of efficiency, validity, and applicability, three qualities that are often used to describe quote unquote good scales. How does the disabled body fit into the normative conceptualizations necessary to build these scales? This is something I address throughout. In the bulk of the project, I lay out a history which is generally chronological from the middle to the end of the 20th century. It is necessary at times to move back and forth, however, and often the timelines overlap. I begin with a history of pain measurement from the middle of the 20th century on, and a history of the ways in which the infliction and expression of pain has been conceptualized culturally. Focusing on the former, there's a pretty clear connection between the ways that the medico-scientific community adopted new thinking about pain and the research of the anesthesiologist Henry Beecher, who argued that pain studies need to be large in scale rather than the small N studies that were generally accepted until his work in the 1950s. These changes were interlaced with the emergence of synthetic analgesics after World War II and the pharmaceutical corporations selling them, who were now willing to fund large-scale studies. Finding tools that could quickly and accurately facilitate the measurement of pain amongst as many subjects as possible is, at this point then, a high priority. So by the time the visual analog scale is first used in a pain study in 1967, the field is ready to adopt it in a widespread manner. I'm sure most of you are familiar with how the VAS works, but what's important to note here is that while the tool was not used in pain medicine until the 1960s, it actually has roots going back to the 1920s as the graphic rating scale. The GRS, a tool developed for the rapid and reliable evaluation of students and workers, offered a perceived freedom to the evaluator by providing them with a nearly blank line upon which to rate any individual or unindividual on any given metric. And so here you see it at the bottom of the screen, from extremely neat and clean, almost a dude, all the way to very slovenly and unkempt. As the line was further stripped of its ornaments and graduations during its transformation into the visual analog, as opposed to digital, scale, the tool offered more possibilities to its users. No dots, notches, labels, or numerals offered any sort of guidance along the scale. And so in this first case study, you see my general methodology, using citations to trace a scale and its influences backward in time in order to produce a homology of sorts, while also drawing on design studies, visual STS, and disability studies to take on how the scale's design impacts both the individual patient and socio-political and cultural as a whole. Its derivatives may also be an important factor here. In the next case studies, I apply the same techniques. Today's body diagram, or pain map, can be traced directly back to a paper written by Harold Palmer in the New Zealand Medical Journal in 1949. I place his body outline next to the work of Henry Dreyfuss and Associates, whose Joe and Josephine figures, seen here, emerged at the same time as Palmer's diagram and are representative of a post-war anthropometrics driven by engineering and drafting visual standards. And so you can see the sort of engineering style arrows and lines and markings here. What does it mean, I ask, for the body to be represented in the same way as a hubcap or a desk chair? How does it jettison the non-normative body? The diagram was and is still used in clinical settings to literally test the subject. If they make symmetrical or orderly marks on their pain diagram, the pain probably is psychological and not physical. Here's Palmer's original article noting that symmetry in the pain diagram is almost, quote, diagnostic of a functional nervous disorder. The article is still being cited in studies related to correlating pain diagrams and psychological health today. Just as the language of drafting is used to reify the engineer or designer's expertise as arbiter of what the world should look like, so is the body diagram used to reinforce the examiner's expertise, or more poignantly, the patient's subordination to the expert. Finally, the face-based pain scale moves from the blank slate of the body diagram to the heavily affected face of the child. Here we see a theme that had been present, but not terribly explicit in the case studies preceding, that is, neoliberal governmentality's heavy emphasis on efficiency at the service of austerity, percolating to the surface in the Reagan administration and the HMOs of the 1980s and 1990s. The relatively rapid development of graphic scales featuring photographed or illustrated faces can be traced back to the work of, quote, the mother of pediatric pain management, Jo Eland. Eland's 1974 nursing master's thesis, Children's Communication of Pain, is cited by nearly every paper which introduces a new face-based pediatric scale throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s. These scales were all developed by either practicing pediatric nurses themselves or researchers adjacent to that field. Eland cites the influence of the Children's Apperception Test, drawing a line from projective techniques in pediatric psychology, wherein children are asked to identify with and provide narratives to various cartoonish scenes, excuse me, through to the ways that the affective force of pain might be visible on sparsely drawn faces. Eventually, I argue that the projective techniques and cartoon drawings were chosen just as the bare VAS and simple body diagram outline for their universalizing properties. This is especially salient when contextualizing the role of the nurse at the end of second wave feminism and the beginning of neoliberal austerity. Focusing on the images themselves, I also argue that we might understand their possible effect on our overall cultural understanding of pain through the ugly laws that governed the disappearance, incarceration, and institutionalization of the disabled body throughout the West's history. So from here, I looked at this project and realized I had a pretty good set of case studies. I started thinking about how to turn this into a manuscript, but every time I did, I was left feeling like something was missing. That is, the explicit contribution of those who encounter this scale on a regular basis, so the patients in pain and the practitioners who care for them. Recently, I've received a small SSHRC Explore grant to pilot some focus groups of patients and practitioners to show them the scales, talk a bit about their respective lineages, and ask them to talk about their experiences in that context. I don't know if it'll work, especially as I've never really undertaken ethnographic research of this sort before, so I'm hoping maybe you all might have some feedback or recommendations. The ultimate goal of this entire project is to help those of us who encounter these scales regularly understand that these tools do not just appear out of nowhere, that they are designed with certain biases and powers built into them, and that maybe one day we can collectively argue for more appropriate means of pain evaluation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gabi. What a fantastic and interesting presentation. Okay, so our last speaker today is Dr. Karime Mah, who is a MITAC's postdoctoral fellow in the Childhood Rehabilitation, Ethics, and Disability Research Lab at Western University and the Neuro Rehab Outcomes via Education and Learning Lab at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. Her research is also funded by Views on Interdisciplinary Childhood Ethics at McGill University. She's a critical qualitative health researcher in critical rehabilitation studies, employing critical qualitative and arts-based methodologies. Dr. Mah's current work explores how concussion recovery is discursively understood by young people, drawing on her background in nursing and occupational therapy, as well as her lived experience of concussion. Dr. Mah's research aims to disrupt conventional ways of thinking and knowing about concussion in young people, while challenging clinicians and researchers to reimagine concussion education, care, and research. For her doctoral work, she was awarded a Pursuit Award by the Bloorview Research Institute at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital, and named 2021 recipient of the highly regarded Joan Eakin Award for Methodological Excellence in a Qualitative Dissertation at the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research at the University of Toronto. Thank you, Katie.
There. Sorry. Some technical difficulties. Here we go.
No worries. Okay, perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. As Laura mentioned, my name is Karime Mah. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Western University, working with Dr. Gil Teachman. I'm a critical qualitative health researcher, and my doctoral and postdoctoral research are located in the field of youth concussion. But I'm just starting to venture into the chronic pain space. And so I feel very fortunate to be part of CASPR and to be speaking to you as part of this webinar series. And actually just listening to Jen, Karime, and Gabi, I actually feel like when compared to my home of youth concussion, this space is much more friendly to critical social perspectives and ways of thinking and doing research otherwise. Today, I'm going to walk you through my journey from understanding drawing as method in quite reductive terms to appreciating it for all that it can bring to the research endeavor and how it can reach the status of methodology when engaged thoughtfully and within a robust theoretical framework. While my journey occurred in the context of my concussion research, the lessons that I learned are equally applicable to explorations of other abstract health phenomenon using drawing or other visual arts-based research methods including pain, as other speakers have spoken to so eloquently. So the aim of my doctoral study was to investigate, challenge, and transform conventional ways of thinking and knowing about concussion and about young people. I don't have the time to share the findings of this work, but perhaps the most interesting outcome for this audience is that through engaging a critical social approach, I was able to demonstrate that concussion is as much or more a social phenomenon as it is biological, which is a fairly novel way of thinking about concussion in the field. With that said, I'll turn back to my methods and methodology and speak to how I generated data with young people. I had 43 participants in my doctoral study between 6 and 18 years of age, both with and without a history of concussion. Each participant generated a drawing depicting how they understood concussion. And this task varied for those, excuse me, with lived experience of concussion and those without. So for participants without lived experience, they produced a drawing in response to the phrase, "When I hear the word concussion, I." Those with lived experience produced a drawing in response to the phrase, "Before my concussion, I," and another in response to the second phrase, "Now, I." After generating their drawing, I invited each participant to engage in a qualitative semi-structured interview where I used their drawing as an elicitation device to explore how they thought and felt about concussion at the time of the study. Now, when I present this work, these are the questions that inevitably come up. Can I use drawing to study X health condition? Can I use drawing with Y age range or population? The answer, I'm afraid, is that it really depends. It's not specific to health phenomenon or age. So rather than provide an answer, I urged researchers to ask themselves the question, how do I regard visuals in research? Now, there is a tendency to think of visual data as providing a window or an unobscured view into the world or identity of the person who created the visual. My position is that visual data, including drawing data, is no less constructed than word-based data, and that appropriate regard must be given to the analysis and interpretation of visual data. And starting from this premise, researchers can ask themselves more specific questions to explore their assumptions about drawing in research, including what do I hope to achieve by using drawing, or in other words, what do I think drawing might offer my study beyond qualitative inquiry more generally? Does drawing as method fit my research question? Does it fit my theoretical framework? And finally, how am I theorizing drawing as method? And in asking these questions, what I hope to achieve is to move people away from thinking about or using drawing as just a sort of cute or innovative or method, and to really think a little bit deeper about the method, and to use it again within a theoretical framework. And I urge people to consider these questions not because I want to deter them from using drawing, but because I want to build capacity in critical arts-based methodologies in health. And this will only be achieved when method is theorized. Pardon me. When I first started working with drawing, I conceptualized it first and foremost as a means to engage young people in the co-production of knowledge about a topic that they'd rarely been consulted on before. Sorry. And there were other reasons. My participants included young people with a history of concussion, as well as those without, which I've mentioned. From a practical standpoint, I believe that while insights regarding concussion might be accessible to those with lived experience, similar insights might not be front of mind for young people without that lived experience. And so I didn't want to rely on a method that required an immediate response, as can be the case with words-based methods, such as interviews or focus groups, but instead wanted to find a method that allowed participants the time and space to reflect on and to construct knowledge about a topic that they may not have thought about explicitly before. Concussion can also be a very abstract topic, similar to pain. And so I wanted a method that would allow for different kinds of knowledge. So the more emotional, abstract or tacit forms of knowledge that can be generated using arts-based methods. And these were all sound reasons for taking up drawing in the first place. But as I began to use drawing in my work, I felt that my analysis was falling a little flat. And so I knew that I needed to interact more with methodological literature to fix what I was seeing as a problem in my work or a weakness. And this is when I revisited the work of Gillian Rose, who's a cultural geographer, who's written extensively about doing research with visual methods, and with the work of Marilis Gilman, who is a sociologist of health and illness and who draws on Rose in her empirical work with women with heart disease. By engaging with Rose and Gilman's work, I came to think of drawing methodologically as a reflective and meaning-making process, whereby each young participant in my study constructed knowledge of concussion through the process of creating and then sharing their drawing in the research setting. I came to think of drawing as an analyzable and interpretable product. So it's a source of knowledge of the broader social discourses shaping how young people regarded concussion and how they regarded themselves in relation to concussion. And I came to regard drawings as means through which to visualize discourse and visualize subjectivity. By theorizing drawing in this way, my method achieved coherence with my Foucauldian-informed theoretical framework, while enabling me to gain analytic insight into the multiple and complex ways that young people make sense of concussion. Now, the second question that I inevitably get is, how exactly do you analyze a drawing? And I've included an asterisk here to indicate that I read and read the drawing data alongside interview data. So I treated all data as text to be read in the post-structuralist sense as manifestations of dominant societal ways of thinking. And so I approached the data not with an eye of discovering sort of the truth of concussion as perceived by the young person, but with an eye toward deconstructing the data and revealing the dominant assumptions informing it. I found it very helpful to ask myself, not only what does this participant think, but also how has this participant come to think this way? From a more procedural or process perspective, I took an overview of all data first before analyzing each participant's interview and drawing data separately, and then exploring the relationship between each participant's interview and drawing data. I also asked specific questions about the production of the drawing as product, and the intended audience for the drawing, which you can see here. And I adapted these questions from Rose and Gilman's work and added questions that were inspired by my theoretical framework and are specific to discourse and subjectivity and are pictured here. So to locate discourse, I examined not only what children said or the language they used, but also the practices they used when confronted with concussion in their daily lives. For example, I interrogated the data to understand the strategies children used to obtain knowledge about concussion, how they assessed knowledge as true or as false, and relatedly, who they trusted as legitimate sources of knowledge about concussion. I asked questions of the data, including what discourses must be in operation for this participant to frame concussion in this way, and are any alternative discourses offered? To locate subjectivity in and across the data, I examined how young people acted upon themselves to shape themselves as particular types of subjects, for example, as responsible subjects who avoid risk, as well as how they presented themselves to me in the research setting and through their drawing. Before moving on, I want to stress that if I had only engaged with the literature telling me how to use drawing in research from more of a procedural perspective, and not the literature telling me how to think about how I was thinking about drawing in my research, I know that I wouldn't have puzzled through how to bring drawing as method together with my theoretical framework, and I would not have achieved the same depth of analysis or contributed new knowledge to the field. And this is the lesson that I'll take through with me to my emerging work in the field of childhood pain, which is by no means a solo venture, but will be undertaken in collaboration with Fiona Webster, Gail Teachman, and Linda Zhang, who's a master's student in my lab. We're in the process of finalizing the methodology right now, but it will likely include some combination of body map storytelling, visual body map storytelling within a critical disability studies framework. And just like in my doctoral work, we will engage this visual arts-based research method reflexively as a means through which to make visible the abstract nature of pain, the social processes and power relations that shape how pain services are accessed or not by a so-called vulnerable population, being disabled children, and how young people experience and make sense of the complex interplay of disability, impairment, and chronic pain in their everyday lives. If you're interested in the substantive findings or methodological insights generated through my doctoral work, you can search these publications. Again, they are in the space of youth concussion, but I do believe that they have implications to pain. And you can always email me or reach out to me by Twitter, because I'm always happy to chat methodology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Okay, I'm going to invite all of the panelists to turn on your videos and your microphone. And for the attendees, please add your questions to the chat box or the Q&A box. And we're also welcoming Fiona Webster to this panel as well, who is also the lead of the CASPR project. So I will begin with the first question as we're waiting for questions to come in. And I'd like to pose to you all the same question that I asked at last month's CASPR webinar session, considering that focus was also on methodology, except, with the more specific focus of institutional ethnography. So what words of wisdom would you give to those critical pain researchers who are interested in arts-based or other newly emerging methodologies?
Maybe I'll start because I'm just kind of entering into this space, if that's okay. And so other people might have more specific feedback, but I would say first and foremost, find a community of practice. Such as this, or I have another sort of community through U of T, the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research, because in the concussion space, I found this work to be a little bit daunting, a little bit lonely, until I was able to find those who thought similarly to me, and which I think is what CASPR offers. And so I'll leave it there and just let other people speak more specifically to their experiences in pain.
I think picking up on that, I would say recognizing how you use those methods and being able to make the argument for them as methods of social research and not just as art. Certainly I've found in speaking to artists, we have very different understandings of what the aim of those kinds of methods is. And I think it's important to distinguish and to be clear about that distinction in working that way.
I'm very new to this space too. I've only been in contact with, critical qualitative methodologies, post-qualitative methodologies in my PhD, which I just finished last year. But I would say, like this creativity of thinking outside the box, or thinking new ways of incorporating new methods, new ways of thinking, which are theoretically based. That would be, because one of the things I've never thought of this type of methods, putting methods together or thinking through the type of theoretical underpinnings and concepts that I used. I would never think of using it as a physio. So, and it allowed me to see so many other things. So I think, yeah, the creativity and trying to explore different ways of approaching research and thinking about research as well.
I think my methodology is just a bit, it's like a bit different, right, than what I think maybe Laura you're asking about, but I will kind of give the advice that I give my students all the time, which is that a line is never just a line, and that there's always ideology and history baked into anything we see. And so to remember that and think about where you can sort of try to unpack that.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have a question from one of the audience members. Hi, I'm considering the relative merits of a photo voice study. Could the panel offer any opinions on the pros and cons of this approach? Thank you. If anyone is familiar with photo voice.
I am, to some extent. Nobody else wants to comment. So yeah, I think the thing to keep in mind with photo voice is the questions about what it means to give voice to a population, whether into a community, whether that's something that you're able to do, is that your goal? There's a lovely paper in visual studies by, sorry, I can't remember the name, but it's called The Bad and the Ugly, and it's about the things that can go wrong in a photo voice study. So just being conscious of what it means to get people involved in that kind of participatory work. Doesn't mean that you can't do it, but always just being conscious of how you're positioning yourself in relation to them, what the power relationships of that, what's implied within kind of the power relationships of that. Whether something like photo elicitation, which is sort of a less, in certain ways, a more neutral way of describing photo voice, but just being clear about the kind of differentiation of how you're using those methods and making sure that participants' experiences are really able to come through in that.
I can add to that if nobody else wants to jump in right away. But I don't have experience specifically with photo voice. But I would say, just to sort of think about that question that I posed about how are you regarding visuals in your research? So what is it they bring to your research beyond qualitative methods or qualitative inquiry more generally? And to really attend to analysis. So one of the most sort of helpful questions that I found, interrogative questions I asked of my data, is what is pictured and what is not. And through asking that, I know I didn't get too much into the findings of my research today, but what I found is that young people's understandings of concussion were really shaped by risk and responsibility discourses. And when thinking about sort of discourses of childhood vulnerability, I expected to see adults represented in very specific and protective roles. And by asking that question of my data, noted a relative absence of adults represented across the data, which really provided me insight into this notion that young people were feeling very alone in their experiences of concussion and throughout recovery. And so I'd say that piece, when working with visual data, is really, really important, just that idea of present absence in your analysis.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question for Gabi. What are your thoughts about the depiction of gender and/or ethnicity in pain tools?
It's a great question. The short answer is it's complicated, right? I think a lot about universal design, which is this sort of, it's been kind of a popular buzz within the design field over the last 5 years or so, but it goes back decades, where the idea is that by designing for the margins, right, we can sort of capture the universal, if you think of a bell curve, right, which is, a problematic visual in a different presentation. But there's as I kind of mentioned, there's a universalizing quality to these scales, and that comes from both the urge to seek efficiency right? And that goes again back to the sort of the neoliberal austerity regime that governs our medico-scientific, community and field these days. But if you think about like emojis, there was a real big push in, I want to say, like 5 years ago or so, to add different colored faces to emojis, because we sort of started to come to the realization that the default yellow was actually, rather than like a shift away from whiteness, it was actually sort of picking a default that then would create a default and be associated with the default, right? The kind of which is whiteness. And when Wong and Baker were choosing their faces for the faces scale, right, which is that like the most popular one, it's got the circles, right? It's kind of the one that's also been memeified and become a bunch of a trope online. They chose the cartoon face because, right, they wrote that it avoids gender, age, and racial biases, when in reality, when you look at it, it is a white face. And then so the Oucher scale, which is not really popular at all, which is photographs of children in various states of rest or distress. The person whose name is escaping me right now, but who designed the Oucher scale, she started putting out guidelines of how you can sort of put together different ones with different races, and then other people started contributing them with different races, because she, of course, not of course, but she used a white child for it. Layer this all with very clear research over the last decade or so that's saying that Black women are their pain is rarely believed, they're mistreated in the clinical context because of that. And so how do we sort of resolve the two? So like I said, the short answer is it's complicated. The long answer is a bit more rambling, but it's really thinking about how we're going to balance this need for efficiency, which may or may not be a valid need, but is real, and the necessity to speak to a wide range of individuals across a spectrum of gender and ethnicity. So I hope that sort of answered your question. Thank you for it.
Thanks. And we do have a comment, so not a question. Thank you all, really interesting and inspiring. So there's no more questions coming in, and we are, kind of sitting around the time that we would like to end. Fiona, is there something that you would like to add in today's session?
No, not at all. Just to say how wonderful it was. So congratulations to all the speakers and thank you.
All right. Well, that concludes today's session. Thank you all for attending. Again, please be sure to visit the CASPR website, that's criticalpainscholarship.ca, to register for future webinars and to learn more about this international community of practice. And for attendees, please expect a Qualtrics survey. And if you could please fill that out, the evaluation form, that would be wonderful, because it helps direct us in the development of these CASPR webinar sessions. So thank you all again, and have a good rest of the day.